In 2007, when the Estonian government removed a statue commemorating Russia's role in World War II from a central square, they were reflecting popular opinion. Estonia is a former Soviet republic that relishes its freedom from Russian control in Moscow. Yet this simple gesture caused the entire governmental system to come under sustained attack from Russian hackers using distributed denial of service tactics. DDoS attacks are those attacks we talked about, where a website is taken offline by a flood of service connection requests, blocking legitimate users from access. Now, Estonia has built an economy and a governmental system that is highly dependent on internet access. In fact, Estonia is often said to be the first fully wired country in the world. Because Estonia only recently emerged from under Soviet control, they effectively leaped in one step of infrastructure development directly to the web. Almost all of their government and private sector services, like tax filings and banking, are completely online. But because of this, the 3-week attack by Russian hackers, Estonia's economy was brought to a grinding halt. Now, it probably goes too far to call what the hackers did an act of war. No shots were fired, and the attackers didn't have the goal of bringing down the Estonian government. So how do we classify these kinds of cyber attacks? Though classification is always fraught with difficulty, this particular attack was an example of what is often referred to as hacktivism. Coined in 1996, the word hacktivism combines the words hack with the word activism, and it suggests the use of computer hacking methods to stage a protest or make a political statement. Today, we're going to enter the netherworld of hacker activists and cyber insurgency. In this shadowy realm, it sometimes seems that there are as many different actors with different motivations as there are grains of sand on the beach. And because of this, it can be difficult to distinguish the good guys from the bad guys, and indeed to determine where a noble motive becomes a criminal act. By the end of this lecture, we'll be able to identify some of the strange actors in this online bestiary. We'll also understand that hacktivists come essentially in 3 flavors, although those flavors often are mixed together. The flavors are political activists, cyber insurgents, and criminal mischief makers. Now, in our last lecture, we looked at the lowest level of our threat pyramid, the place where fraud and organized crime run rampant. Today's topic, hacktivism and cyber insurgency, moves us up to the next level in our conceptual pyramid. Cyber insurgency is a bit of a halfway house, a little like war and a little like crime, with some political free speech thrown in for good measure. To my mind, the fight most resembles what the military calls a low-intensity conflict. When cyber insurgents attack websites, or when patriotic hackers launch an attack against Estonia, they're starting to look like they're actually fighting a war in cyberspace. But often, their weapons are limited to simple cyber tools. And the main thing that results from their actions is the defacement of a website or the denial of access. There are some real differences between these fights and true war. Cyber intrusions by non-state actors are not between sovereign nations. They don't have any territory to protect, and the hackers are practically immune from military retaliation. And because cyber insurgents are so hard to pin down, they pose a significant risk and danger to stability. If their motives are sufficiently pernicious, we might think of them as cyber terrorists. On the other hand, if their motives are more pure, perhaps they are cyber civil rights protesters. The hard questions are, who are these guys? And what do they want? So, one good way to start to understand this phenomenon is through the prism of the 2010 WikiLeaks disclosures and the subsequent support of WikiLeaks by the hacktivist group Anonymous. The familiar part of this story is about how the web creates greater transparency and ends secrecy. That's a topic we'll discuss in another lecture. But the less familiar part of the story, of interest to us today, is how WikiLeaks led to something we might call the Wiki War. Now, WikiLeaks is an organization dedicated to the publication of secret documents and confidential information. In the past, they've set their sights on governments ranging from Zimbabwe to Tunisia. In 2010, WikiLeaks turned its attention to America, first releasing a military video, then war diary summaries from Iraq and Afghanistan, and at the end, more than 200,000 classified State Department cables. With its disclosure of classified information, WikiLeaks challenged state authority. Yet one of the most significant responses to its activities came from the private sector. There is no evidence that the government ordered or requested any actions, but the combination of official displeasure and clear public disdain for WikiLeaks founder Julian Assange soon led a number of major Western corporations, MasterCard, PayPal, and Amazon to name three, to stop selling their services to WikiLeaks. Amazon reclaimed rented server space that WikiLeaks had used, and the two financial institutions, PayPal and MasterCard, well, they stopped processing donations made to WikiLeaks. What soon followed might well be described as the first cyber battle between non-state actors. Supporters of WikiLeaks, specifically the loosely organized group Anonymous that we talked about in Lecture 3, started a series of DDoS attacks on the websites of the major corporations that they thought had taken an anti-WikiLeaks stand. The goal was to try and flood their websites so as to prevent legitimate access to them. These attacks were based on the Low Orbit Ion Cannon, or LOIC program, that we discussed in Lecture 4. You recall that the LOIC is so simple that you can download it yourself. Just plug the name into your search engine. Once installed on your computer, all you have to do is give the LOIC a target address, say MasterCard's website, and hit Go. The LOIC will then use its automated programming to try and overwhelm the website with connection requests. By the way, it should be obvious, but in case it isn't, don't do this. Using the LOIC, as I've described, is illegal, and it could land you in jail. But the simple truth is that the LOIC is easy to use. Almost anyone can operate it. That's one of the reasons the anonymous hackers are sometimes called script kiddies. Their tools, or some of them, are simple ones that even a child can use. Now, in addition to launching reprisal attacks against corporations like PayPal and Amazon, Anonymous also hacked the website of the Swedish prosecuting authority. They were seeking Mr. Assange's extradition to Sweden to face criminal charges. Some of the coordination for these attacks was done through social media, such as Facebook or Twitter. Meanwhile, other supporters created hundreds of mirror websites, replicating WikiLeaks content so that it couldn't be effectively shut down. The hackers even adopted a military-style nomenclature, dubbing their efforts Operation Payback. And when Anonymous attacked, the other side fought back. The major sites used defensive cyber protocols to oppose Anonymous. As a result, most attacks were relatively unsuccessful. The announced attack on Amazon, for example, was abandoned shortly after it began because the assault was ineffective. Perhaps even more tellingly, someone, and no group has publicly claimed credit, began an offensive operation against Anonymous itself. Anonymous ran its operations through a website, anonops.net, and that website was itself subject to a DDoS counterattack that took it offline for a number of hours. In short, a conflict readily recognizable as a battle between competing forces took place in cyberspace, and it was waged almost exclusively between non-state actors. Now, this first cyber conflict ended in something of a draw. We can be sure, however, that Anonymous will learn from this battle and approach the next one with a greater degree of skill and better perspective on how to achieve its ends. Indeed, many of the group's subsequent attacks, like the 2012 effort to shut down the Vatican website, have shown a great deal more sophistication and effectiveness. Moreover, Anonymous has demonstrated that even with its limited capacity, it can do significant damage to individuals and companies. And some of its attacks are more sophisticated than the LOIC. When Aaron Barr, the corporate head of the cybersecurity firm HB Gary, announced that his firm was investigating the identity of anonymous participants, Anonymous retaliated. They hacked the HB Gary network, which was itself significantly embarrassing for a cybersecurity company, and they took possession of internal emails. Those emails, in turn, suggested that HB Gary was engaged in some questionable business practices. As a result, Barr was forced to resign his post. This is exactly the type of individual consequence that is sure to deter others from going after Anonymous. Anonymous has made quite clear that it intends to continue to prosecute the cyber war against, amongst others, the United States. Quote, "It's a guerrilla cyber war. That's what I call it," end quote, says Barrett Brown, age 29, who's a self-described senior strategist and propagandist for Anonymous. He said, quote, "It's sort of an unconventional, asymmetrical act of warfare that we're involved in." Or consider the manifesto posted by Anonymous, declaring cyberspace independence from the world governments. It says, quote, "We declare the global social space we are building together to be naturally independent of the tyrannies and injustices you seek to impose on us. You have no moral right to rule us, nor do you possess any real methods of enforcement. We have true reason to fear." That's the end of the quote. In February 2012, Anonymous went further, formally declaring war against the United States and calling on its citizens, that's you and me, to rise and revolt. Indeed, in many ways, Anonymous conducts itself in the same manner that an armed insurgency might. In February 2012, for example, Anonymous hacked into a telephone conversation between the FBI and Scotland Yard, who were talking about the development of a prosecution case against Anonymous. That sort of tactic, intercepting the enemy's communications, is exactly the type of tactic an insurgency might use. And by disclosing the capability, Anonymous has successfully sown uncertainty about how much else it might be intercepting. Now, one problem with the metaphor of war or insurgency, however, is that Anonymous and other groups like it they're not monolithic. They have as many different agendas as they do people. At some points, they look like hacktivists who have a political agenda of some sort. Yet at others, they seem like vigilantes or criminals. And in other cases, they just seem like they're out for fun, drawing graffiti on websites or engaging in other criminal mischief. And at still other points, they look a lot like traditional political activists, fostering freedom of speech. For example, hacktivists provided technical assistance to the Arab Spring protesters and helped them evade authoritarian reprisals. And on the day I sat down to begin writing this lecture, the press reported that Anonymous had hacked into an Arab bank. The group published thousands of bank account names and numbers and threatened to destroy the bank's electronic systems if it did not publicly acknowledge that it had helped terrorist groups such as Al-Qaeda and Al-Shabaab. It's really quite a challenge to get a handle on a group like this, when the actions of its members veer so wildly from the one extreme of participating in a near cyber war to the other of supporting free speech for political dissidents. In fact, in advancing their agenda, the members of Anonymous may look most like the anarchists who led movements in the late 19th and early 20th century, albeit anarchists with a vastly greater network and far more ability to advance their disruptive agenda through individual action. And like the anarchists of old, they have their own internal disputes. Recently, another group called Black Hat effectively declared war on Anonymous because it disagreed with some of the Anonymous agenda. And somebody else, nobody knows who, published a list of Anonymous members on a public website. Of course, they did it anonymously. Now, as you probably know, Anonymous is not the only group that looks like an anarchist insurgency hybrid. In the time since the initial Anonymous Wiki-War conflict burst on the scene, a number of other organizations have surfaced that are intent on disrupting internet traffic as a means of expressing some political or sociological viewpoint, though precisely what viewpoint that is often unclear. One of the most notorious was a splinter group known as LulzSec. Very small in number, but very effective and active throughout 2011. The LULZ part of the name is a play on the common text message LOLS, LOLS, which stands for laugh out loud in the plural. And the sec is a shortened form of the word security, all of which indicates that this is a group that laughs at cybersecurity measures. The group claimed responsibility for a number of significant intrusions in 2011, including the compromise of user accounts at Sony, which affected millions of PlayStation 3 users. LulzSec also claimed responsibility for taking a CIA website offline. By many accounts, LulzSec had no more than 6 core members who caused the disruption. Moreover, unlike Anonymous, some of their public posts suggested that they were motivated by a childish enthusiasm for creating disorder, rather than a more anarchic worldview akin to that of Anonymous. In June 2012, however, LulzSec announced that it was quitting. In reaction to threats from other hackers who tried to expose LulzSec. Most notable amongst these anti-LulzSec hackers was the Jester, who went by the handle TH3J35T3R, spelling out Jester. There was a American Special Forces operative who took it upon himself to fight back against LulzSec. His identity, in turn, has now been exposed, and he recently seems to have gone offline. LulzSec's decision to cease operations may also have been because of arrests of at least 3 suspected members of LulzSec by police in the United Kingdom, and a 4th arrest by the FBI in America. Whatever the cause, LulzSec seems to have reduced its operating capacity, though it has the potential to revive at some point. For those of us outside of this obscure world, it is often difficult to understand the origin of some of the names we're hearing, and to learn how to translate them. The use of numbers and other symbols to replace letters is a common motif for computer hackers and other sophisticated users. This language is called LEET. For example, the Jester's handle, TH3J35T3R, involves the number 3, which stands for E, reversed of course, and the 5 stands in for an S. You can see how this works with the name of another relatively new group called Injector Team, where the first word is spelled INJ3CT0R. In 2011, this group claimed that they had compromised a server belonging to the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, NATO. The group announced that they had removed confidential data from a backup server and left behind a scatological message in a notepad file. As with some of the other groups, it is suspected that Injector began as an individual effort and became a team as that individual attracted a group of loyal followers. There are even good guy hackers who fight the bad guy hackers. One of my favorite groups is a German organization known as the Happy Ninjas. They see themselves as the sheriff riding into town, cleaning it up for decent people. In late 2011, for example, they took on a group known as Carters.cc, which was a marketplace for crime. Credit cards were sold, drugs exchanged, child pornography hosted and such. The Happy Ninjas shut them down. In their own words, quote, "Who are we? We are the watchmen, the hackers who quietly observe the scene. If any lamer causes too much trouble, we shut them down." Most of us live by the rule of law. Groups like Anonymous and the Happy Ninjas are more, well, chaotic. One of the deeply unclear questions is how big the reservoir of chaotic good guys is. In the end, maybe the network can police itself, but only time will tell. A particularly thorny issue tied to these cyber intrusions by Anonymous, LulzSec, and their hacking compatriots is the challenge of drawing a line between impermissible crime and lawful activist protest. Many in the hacktivist community see themselves as part of a latter-day civil rights movement. In fact, many of the fringe participants who respond to requests and tasking orders from the leadership of the hacker collective believe that they are lineal descendants of that era. They often say that their denial of service attacks, for example, are just like sit-ins from the prior decades. One lawyer, John Hamasaki of San Francisco, represents a defendant who allegedly participated in an anonymous denial of service attack on PayPal during the Wiki war we talked about earlier. He contends that even if the allegations against his client are true, the most that can be said is that his client engaged in political protest that caused a minor inconvenience. Or, as Eugene H. Spafford, a computer security professor at Purdue, recently put it in describing this Wiki war, quote, "A whole bunch of people were angry. They didn't really think about whether it was legal or not. It never entered their minds. This was kind of the equivalent of a spontaneous street protest, where they may have been throwing rocks through windows, but never thought that was against the law or of hurting anybody." Now, some may wonder whether the analogy holds. After all, most of us would think that throwing a rock through a window is clearly against the law. Nevertheless, for many in America, though not in all the other countries around the globe, this claim resonates, at least to the extent that the protests are nonviolent and don't amount to the virtual equivalent of rock throwing. Many people see the internet as a global commons for political protests, and they watch with a large degree of approval as internet communications tools like Facebook and Twitter are used to foster debate and dissent, as in the Arab Spring movement stirring rebellion in the Middle East. There is reluctance, then, to apply law enforcement principles to some of these insurgents' less disruptive activities, a reluctance that is even greater when we think of responding with force of arms instead of criminal law. In the end, however, the cyber insurgents also live in the real world. They cannot occupy only the cyber persona layer without also occupying the true personal layer. And therein lies the easiest means of responding to their tactics. For some, like the LulzSec members, the response may be an arrest and criminal prosecution. 25 members of Anonymous were likewise arrested in early 2012 by Interpol. And in March 2012, the FBI demonstrated the usefulness of human intelligence in combating cyber insurgents when it arrested more members of LulzSec. It turned out that one of the leaders, the infamous Sabu, whose real name is Hector Xavier Monsegur, had been identified earlier, and he'd become an informant, cooperating with the government in identifying his colleagues. For other institutions, like WikiLeaks, the physical world response has also had a significant effect. By the second half of 2011, the financial pressures brought to bear on WikiLeaks by the cutoff of its traditional funding streams had led it to suspend operations entirely. Subsequent efforts to revive the brand have been fitful at best. Though WikiLeaks has arguably changed the world, it may not survive to see what changes it has wrought. At this juncture, it's worth stepping back a second and noting an important limitation on some of this discussion, that it presupposes that we know what a hacktivist insurgency looks like. Our image thus far is of a group of hacktivists like Anonymous, or in a slightly more organized form, like the patriotic Russian hackers who brought Estonia to its knees. But those aren't the only types of activists who exert control over the internet. In fact, they may be comparatively less effective in their activities than another, more powerful group, the large companies who provide services on the internet themselves. Consider the events of January 18, 2012. A day when a worldwide protest by service providers shut down many portions of the web and modified many others. The protest was directed against a proposed set of online piracy laws under consideration by the U.S. Congress. They went by the acronyms SOPA and PIPA. Wikipedia's English language site went dark completely. Reddit, which is an internet news accumulator, encouraged its users to take today as a day of focus and action to learn about these destructive bills and do what you can to prevent them from becoming a reality. And Google's iconic white search page featured a large black rectangle over their name, symbolizing the alleged censorship that was being protested. Other sites participating in the protest included Craigslist, Mozilla, Imager, and the Consumer Electronics Association. For our purposes, what these sites were protesting is less important than the mechanism they chose for conveying their message. These are not the acts of insurgents in any classical sense of the term. They don't seek to overthrow governments or start a revolution. In many ways, both their ideology for an internet free of regulation and government interference and their tactics, blocking or modifying internet content access, are more than vaguely reminiscent of those adopted by some of the radical internet activists like Anonymous. It seems that some of the most dynamic members of America's innovative corporate community can, when pressed, take advantage of their position at the center of all communications to advance their own interests. And that, too, should give us all pause. It demonstrates that, in a real way, many levers of control in the cyber domain are now held by private sector actors. What if, to take a wild hypothetical example, the owners of Verizon, Google, and Facebook were all opposed to a war that an American administration proposed to wage against, say, Iran? What if they pulled the plug on internet communications, not in support of the other side, but as an expression of their own views on world peace? Would the result be any different than if a patriotic Iranian hacker who supported his country acted to achieve the same result? It seems not. Yet the Iranian hackers would be insurgents in our frame of reference, or even military forces, while corporations would be what? Nobody quite knows. So let's end this lecture with one final cautionary note about hacktivism and our response to it. We should not assume that everyone reacting to a cyber insurgency will do so in the same way. As practiced by Western nations, the fight against activists and insurgents has certain rules. Though the rules can sometimes be broken, for example, with the My Lai massacre in Vietnam. That's the exception rather than the rule. But that's not necessarily the case around the globe. Some nations, Syria and Iran come immediately to mind, can be quite brutal in their response to activism, and that includes cyber activism. Adding even more complexity, non-state actors can also have a varying degree of respect for the rule of law and the conventions of conflict. And there are many non-state actors. When two non-state actors go after each other, almost anything is possible. Late in 2011, for example, Anonymous announced that it had hacked into the database of the notorious Mexican drug cartel known as the Zetas. Inside the database, they had uncovered the names of those Mexican officials who were on the Zetas' payroll and were collaborating with them. Anonymous released a video. They said it would disclose the list unless an anonymous member who'd been kidnapped in Veracruz was released. The Zetas' response was chilling, but effective. They warned Anonymous that if it published the names of the collaborators, the Zetas would retaliate by conducting a mass killing of civilians. 10 people for every collaborator named. Faced with this threat, Anonymous withdrew its own threat and closed down its program known as Operation Cartel. I should add that in the end, the anonymous member was released. But even so, in a highly disturbing way, this story confirms that the cyber domain really can't be disassociated from the physical world. More fundamentally, it suggests that, as with other insurgencies, the advantages held by cyber insurgents depend to some extent on the Western nation's adherence to the rule of law. And that may evaporate if an opponent declines to play by those rules. Which is not to say that there's nothing lawful that we can do, though we would never threaten brutal tactics such as those proposed by the Zetas. We can take steps to create real-world consequences, arrest and prosecution, for example, for those non-state actors who otherwise would face none. But the range of tactics that might be available in response is different for the Western nation-state than for the insurgents. And therein lies the challenge in a nutshell. In this lecture, we've seen that the risks from hacktivism and cyber insurgency are different from those posed by cybercrime. But we've also seen that these risks are just as real, if not more so. And here's the last bit of news. It will likely get worse before it gets better. Today, hacker groups have only limited tools for disrupting the network. Only nation states like the US, China, and Israel possess advanced cyber capabilities to create things like the Stuxnet virus that can cause catastrophic real-world damage. For that reason, today's hackers pose less systemic risk. But that will not last. Soon, we may see hacker groups with significant warlike capabilities. And so, in our next lecture, we'll turn to that topic. What is cyber war, and what will it look like? I look forward to continuing with you next time.